SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good morning. I'm Rajan Barrett from the Department of English, MS University of Baroda, and I am here to talk to you about Sidney and Spenser. Well, on the left you see the picture of Sidney, and on the right you see a picture of Spenser. Probably these are images that we don't really know how good they are because this is before the day of the camera, but these are paintings that we have about them, and you can see that both these people are what you call courtly people because of the Elizabethan ruff. We know that they are from the Elizabethan age, and this is the ruff that they have around their neck. Sir Philip Sidney is the first person I would like to talk about. Though both Philip Sidney and Spenser were known to each other, they had some kind of common understanding with each other. Sidney's dates are 30th of November 1554 to the 17th of October 1586. Now here we have a young man who dies at a very young age, and he dies in a war. But what we must remember is the ideal of the Renaissance man, the poet, courtier and scholar, which is what Sidney was supposed to be. And what is important is that is the idea of what you call the Renaissance man. We know the idea of the Renaissance, and the idea is that the Renaissance man is a person who is so much associated with being a human being of all the possible capabilities that a human being could achieve. Now let's just have a look at some of the works of Sidney. One of the very famous works that we know of is ASTROPHEL and STELLA, which is 1591. The second one is ARCADIA, 1598. Apology for Poetry is a kind of critical work, which is the first critical work that Sidney ever wrote, and it's one of the landmark works in English kind of criticism. Now, ASTROPHEL and STELLA were a book of sonnets supposedly for a lady called Lady Penelope Rich. Lady Penelope Rich is a sonnet lady, also known as the Donna Angelicata. That's the idea of what is called the angelic woman or the Petrarchan unreachable lady or lover. We know that Sidney and Spenser and a number of Elizabethans followed what you call the Petrarchan tradition, which is something which we know of. And we know of something called the Petrarchan conceit, wherein a lady is made much more beautiful than what she is. She is elevated to the status of what we talked about just now, called the Donna Angelicata, which is the angelic woman. And as far as the conceit is concerned, this is something that goes beyond the realm of anything reachable. This is only an idealized form of beauty, an idealized form of love, and that's exactly what the Petrarchan conceit is all about. Now, besides using the Petrarchan conceit, he also has a typical Petrarchan kind of sonnet, which has an octave of 8 lines and a sestet of 6 lines, which we know also has what you call the volta or the turn on the 9th line. The sestet, however, which Sidney uses, has different variations, which include style of the English sonnet with the final couplet, also called the G-mel. The G-mel gets its name from an identification of rhyme schemes of the typical English sonnet style, which is ABBA, CD, EF, and it has a closing couplet which is GG. However, the variation one sees is that the sestet, which is what Sidney as a poet does to invent a distinct style. A poet is a person who creates a new style. That was the idea of the Renaissance poet. So it's not only that he uses the idea of the sonnet and copies the sonnet style, but he gives his own variation of the sonnet, and that's why he makes a different kind of style. We see when we come to Spenser how Spenser creates his own stanza, which is called the Spenserian stanza. I said at the beginning that Sidney was known as a poet, a courtier, and a scholar, all wrapped in one. This was the ideal of the Renaissance man. He was a poet, and a poet meant that he knew his grammar well. A courtier meant that he was very polite, he was a gentleman, and he lived in the courts of Queen Elizabeth or whoever the king or the queen was. That was what a courtier was. And a scholar is one who actually sits and studies. We know that he went to Oxford, and that's one of the reasons why very few people at that point of time were called scholars, especially because hardly anybody went to college in Spenser and Sidney's day. And it was very unusual that you had all these three virtues or all these three qualities in one person. And that is one of the reasons why he is the ideal Renaissance man, the poet, courtier, and scholar, all wrapped in one. Now he is also known for his pastoral romance called Arcadia, which is a complicated love story of chivalry. We said just now he was a courtier, and a courtier is a person who lives in the Inns of Court. And when we're talking about chivalry, we're talking about a medieval code of chivalric romance, where you have the lady who's locked away in a castle and the man who's fighting for her, and he pledges himself to her far away, fighting in a war for the beautiful woman that he has locked up somewhere. Now, when we talk about a pastoral, we are talking about a kind of a poem that is located in the rural areas of anywhere in the world, where you have shepherds, you have sheep, right? And at the same time, the romance is a kind of love relationship between the shepherd and the shepherdess. Today, in a post-feminist world, we don't use words like shepherdess, like we don't use words like actress. His scholarship in English is finally seen, and especially as far as English studies is concerned, is seen primarily in the Apology for Poetry, where he takes on the criticism from the poetry of the Puritan quarter, where the Puritans are people who have a kind of moral value about everything, and they think that poetry is extremely immoral. And so one of the things that happens over here is that Sidney, in his Apology for Poetry, defends poetry, and this is a work of criticism that you will definitely have to study sometime whenever you deal with Sidney. And Sidney is known as one of the earliest English critics of literature. Now, we have seen in short Sir Philip Sidney as a poet in his invention, a scholar in his argumentation for poetry, and a courtier in his love for courtly poetry such as the sonnet. This courtier, as a gentleman who was educated at Oxford, also is known for his act of offering water to a fellow soldier at the Battle of Zutphen, when he says, "Thy need is greater than mine." When we look at this, the last line on this page that you can see, "Thy need is greater than mine," that is a line which is associated with something called Epicureanism. Epicureanism is a kind of philosophy where you're talking about pleasure and enjoying pleasure. And what is a supreme pleasure for Sidney is the question of looking after the other, another person, and that is exactly where he becomes the gentleman or the courtier. And the pleasure of being a gentleman is even when you're dying to offer water to somebody and make that person's life happier, because that person probably needs things more than any of us do. Now, this is the funeral of Sidney. It's not a photograph, but it's probably a photograph of one of the early kinds of sketches of Sidney's funeral. And we can see that there is a lot of pomp and splendor associated with Sidney's funeral. And of course, there is a point where he was wounded in a battle and his wound gets gangrenous. That too is marked with a kind of stone which says that here is where Sidney actually suffered a wound, and the wound gets gangrenous and he dies a few days later because of gangrene. Now, we must remember that we spoke of Sidney and Sidney as a poet. Sir Philip Sidney is certainly considered a very good poet, largely because maybe we shouldn't use the word very good, but at that point of time, when one talked about a poet, one normally talked about people who could write sonnets. And along with Sidney is another person who he associated with, and that is Edmund Spenser, whose dates are 1553 to 1599. Not too distant from Spenser's dates. Now, Edmund Spenser is called the poet's poet. One is because he could write sonnets, and it's also important that here the art of writing a sonnet is not an easy thing. The art of writing poetry is difficult because you have to manage something called the iambic pentameter, and you have to see that there is a rhyme scheme which is very, very structured. You cannot have an extra syllable, and that is what happens with Sir Edmund Spenser. Now, some of the works that Edmund Spenser has, and he's very famous for, is a work called the Faerie Queene. Kindly note that there is no spelling mistake on my part, but this is how fairy is spelt at this point of time, and so also queen is spelt, and that's in the 16th century. The Shepherd's calendar is 1579, and here again Shepherd's is spelt quite differently from the way we do. Amoretti is 1595, and this is a book of sonnets. Epithalamion is an ode. Four Hymns and Prothalamion again is a set of poems, and that's in 1596. Now, the genres of poetry that Spenser used are the epic, that is the Faerie Queene, the pastoral, the sonnet, and the ode. The Faerie Queene is an attempt at a literary epic, which is a complex rendering of courtly matters. We spoke just now about Sidney, who was a courtier. And when we talk about the Faerie Queene, we are talking about a kind of book of poetry which is written to the Queen, and he's trying to make Queen Elizabeth the Faerie Queene, or at least he's pretending that's what he's writing the book for, or that's why he's writing the book. In the Faerie Queene, Spenser goes back to the Arthurian legend. I'm sure we all know what the Arthurian legend is. It's a legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And he has about 12 books, which are what you call the structure of his work, which is around the Knights of the Round Table of King Arthur. And this is a kind of a nationalistic pride that he has in going back to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So for his structure, he has this old legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which is used where he has the Queen, which is supposed to be Queen Elizabeth, and that becomes extremely important to this long epic poem that he has. This, of course, is what you call a literary epic, and it's not a real epic like the Iliad and the Odyssey or the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Now, when Spenser goes back to the Fairy Queen, he also goes back to something interesting, and that is he goes back to the Germanic roots of the English language. We have roots from German. As we know, English is what you call Anglo-Saxon. The Angles and the Saxons are two tribes which come from Europe, and Saxony is in Germany. So the English language is normally called an Indo-Germanic language, which is something I'm sure we know about when we study the English language. So what Spenser does is he goes back to these Germanic roots and tries to build on the pride of the language, which is called Anglo-Saxon or English. Spenser is also known for his Spenserian stanza. We just now spoke about Sidney, and we spoke about how Sidney uses the sestet in very, very interesting ways in the sonnets that he writes in ASTROPHEL and STELLA. Now, Spenser creates his own kind of stanza, which he uses in the Fairy Queen and in other places when he writes his poetry. Now, I'm sure we know what iambic pentameter is. It's an unstressed and stressed syllable. That's what you call an iamb. And the pentameter means 5 syllables, 5 feet, right, of 2 syllables each, unstressed and stressed, and put together they make 10 syllables. And the final line of the Spenserian stanza is a line in what you call hexameter, which is 6 iambs, and that is called an Alexandrine. The rhyme scheme of the stanza is AB, AB, BC, BC, C. Besides, Spenser in the Fairy Queen is using something that we know as the allegorical mode, because we must remember that Spenser lives in very, very political times where there is no democracy, there are no courts to hear you, and even if there were, the authority of the king or the queen is paramount. So the king or the queen could always ask you could always ask for the head of somebody, as we know is something that happens to two important poets who get the iambic pentameter to England and who get the sonnet form to England, and that's Wyatt and Surrey. Now, what is the use of using an allegorical mode? The allegorical mode that is used in the Fairy Queen is an extended kind of metaphor where when one reads it, one cannot really find out what is going on unless one understands the political situation. So when you read the Fairy Queen, you'll find that here you have the allegory which is used right through, and you have the likeness of exactly what is going on, and it looks as if it's a medieval romance. It's looked as if this is fairyland, but the politics of the Elizabethan court is subtly woven into the Fairy Queen. Now here is a kind of a facsimile of the first printout of the Fairy Queen. You can notice the spellings that are used over here. Okay, and you can see that you have it in 12 books, right? And following 12 moral virtues. This is something that was associated with each of the 12 knights, the temperance, and all the kind of virtues that people have. He has 12 of them, and 12 is a number that you have in the Arthurian legend, which is also a number that you get from what is called the 12 disciples of Christ. Now here is the cover page of the 4 hymns, and you can see EDM Spenser written over there, and made by Edmund Spenser, right, and printed for V. Vivian Pulseby, right? Pulseby, right? That's what we have, and 1596. Now this is a signature of Edmund Spenser, which seems as if it's just a scribble, but remember that it's very, very difficult to have people writing at that time. Very few people knew to write, and these are highly educated people, and one of the arts that they did learn was calligraphy, or the art of using a cut nib. With that, I would like, before I close and say thank you, I think what is important for me is to look at both these very, very important poets which we constantly study. Now, when we talk about Spenser, Spenser is a person who writes an epic. Sidney doesn't write an epic, or doesn't even attempt such a thing, but Sidney is known as a scholar. Sidney also has a lot of poems written again, which are the sonnet form. One of his poems is to grammar, which is something that is interesting, because at that point of time, nobody knew whether poetry would be part of grammar or philosophy. Where exactly poetry would fit was a problem that most people had, and this was something that was not fixed and not certain. But the same and the very interesting thing that happens over here is that Spenser actually writes sonnets to grammar. Spenser writes in his sonnets, right? Here you have Sidney also doing very, very interesting things with the sonnet. Spenser and Sidney both play with the lines and the rhyme scheme. Spenser and Sidney also invent certain kinds of forms. Maybe they're keeping to the classical form, but at the same time, they're creating their own kind of structure. Now, when we talk about them together, we must remember that they knew each other, or they had some contact with each other. Now, whether that contact was about writing poetry or not, we don't really know enough, but we could assume that they did share some of their poetry, they did share some of their writing, and that is one of the things that becomes extremely important for us to remember. We must remember also that here you have Sidney writing to Lady Penelope Rich, and then later he tries to say no, he's written the sonnets to his wife. Spenser writes to the sonnets and addresses them to his wife Elizabeth. Now, these are very interesting sonnets, and Spenser is known as a poet's poet, as we said before. Sidney is known as a courtier, poet and scholar, and all wrapped in one. And I think we have two very interesting people whose lives were not only about writing poetry, but who also lived in the courts, were also clever enough not to be killed in courts, in the kinds of palace intrigues or the kind of politics of the court, and at the same time, both of them are remembered as poets. Edmund Spenser lived for a long time in Ireland, and that's one of the problems that he has with the administration. But at the same time, one of the things that happens to him is that he gets all the different kinds and shades of green that Ireland has into his poetry, and you find that there's a lot of color that is used in his poetry, which comes from Ireland. And I think with that, I would like to conclude with my presentation on Sidney and Spenser. Thank you.
SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.